Heaven and Earth by René Guénon. Heaven covers, earth supports. So runs the traditional formula that defines, with the greatest of precision, the roles of these two complementary principles and symbolically demarcates their positions, respectively above and below, in relation to the 10,000 beings, that is, the totality of universal manifestation. Footnote: we've explained elsewhere the reason for the choice of the number 10,000 as a symbolic representation of the indefinite, Les principes du calcul infinitésimal, Chapter 9. As for heaven's covering, we will recall that an identical symbolism is contained both in the Greek word uranos, which is equivalent to the Sanskrit varuna and derives from the root var, to cover, and also in the Latin caelum, which comes from celare, to conceal or cover. See The Lord of the World, translated by various hands, Ellingstring, York's 1983, Chapter 7. Here we find posited, on one hand, the actionless quality of the activity of heaven, or Purusha. Footnote: in theological language, the working of the Holy Spirit, which we mentioned earlier, is sometimes given the name obumbratio, overshadowing, and this is fundamentally an expression of the same idea. And on the other hand, the passivity of earth, or prakriti, which, strictly speaking, is a ground or support for manifestation. Footnote: compare the etymological meaning of the word substance, literally that which stands beneath, and consequently also a plane of resistance and halting for the celestial forces and influences acting downwards from above. Furthermore, this is applicable at any level of existence, for essence and substance can always be envisaged as principles that, in a relative sense, that is, in relation to each particular state of manifestation, correspond to universal essence and universal substance in their relation to the totality of manifested existence. Footnote: this will help us in particular to understand later on how the role of mediator can in fact be ascribed to true man, as well as to transcendent man. Otherwise, without this observation, one might have assumed that it should be applied to the latter alone. Within the universal, and viewed from the side of their common principle, heaven is active perfection, chien, and earth is passive perfection, kun. Neither of these is perfection in the absolute sense. A distinction already exists, and distinction inevitably implies a limitation. Viewed from the side of manifestation, they are merely essence and substance, which necessarily possess a lesser degree of universality because they only appear as such precisely in relation to manifestation. Footnote: see The Symbolism of the Cross, Chapter 23. The first of the two viewpoints indicated here is strictly speaking metaphysical, while the second is more of a cosmological order. Or to be more precise, it actually represents the point of departure for every traditional cosmology. But whatever the viewpoint, and regardless of the level from which they are observed in their correlation with each other, heaven is always an active principle, and earth always a passive principle. Alternatively, to use one of the symbolic contrasts most frequently employed in this context, they are a masculine principle and a feminine principle. And here we have the most classic of all examples of complementarity. Generally speaking, it is from this basic polarity that all the other characteristics of heaven and earth derive, these being in one way or another secondary to it. However, it is advisable to be on the alert here for certain exchanges of attributes which could give rise to misunderstandings, and which in fact can occur fairly frequently in traditional symbolism wherever relationships between complementary principles are involved. This is a point we will later have to come back to when we deal with the numerical symbols attributed to heaven and to earth. It is common knowledge that in the case of a complementary relationship between two terms, where one is viewed as active and the other as passive, the active term will generally be represented symbolically by a vertical line and the passive term by a horizontal line. Footnote: see The Symbolism of the Cross, Chapter 6. At times, heaven and earth are also depicted symbolically in this way. But in this particular case, the two lines do not cross each other to form a cross as they usually would, because it is obviously appropriate that the whole of the symbol of heaven should be placed above the symbol of earth. This gives us a perpendicular with the horizontal at its foot. Footnote: we shall see later that this perpendicular has other meanings as well, each of them corresponding to a different point of view. For the moment, however, we are only considering the geometrical representation of the complementary relationship between heaven and earth. And these two lines can be viewed as the altitude and base of a triangle, the sides of which descend from the pinnacle of heaven to determine the real extent of the surface of the earth. That is, to mark off the ground that serves as the support for manifestation. Figure 7. Footnote: the figure produced by arranging the vertical and horizontal in this way is also a well-known symbol today in Anglo-Saxon Freemasonry, although it is not among those retained by the so-called Latin Freemasonry. In building symbolism in general, the vertical represented by the perpendicular or plumb line and the horizontal by the level. A similar arrangement of the two letters Aleph and Ba in the Arabic alphabet also corresponds to the same symbolism. Be this as it may, the kind of geometric representation most frequently encountered in the Far Eastern tradition is one that associates circular shapes with heaven and square shapes with earth, for reasons we have already explained elsewhere. Footnote: the reign of quantity and the signs of the times, chapter 20. Suffice it here to say that if we consider the cycle of manifestation, and by this we refer to any cycle that can be conceived of, ranging from the most extensive in size to the smallest, the descending movement in the cycle proceeds from the upper pole, heaven, to the lower pole, earth. If only a specific cycle is being considered, it will naturally be a question of whatever else happens to represent these poles from a relative point of view. This descending movement can be regarded as taking its point of departure from the least specific of all shapes, the sphere, in order to arrive finally at the shape which is, by contrast, the most fixed of all, the cube. Footnote: the sphere is, of course, the equivalent in three-dimensional geometry of the circle, and the cube of the square. It can be added that the first of these two shapes has an eminently dynamic property, while the second is eminently static, which corresponds once again to the polarity of active and passive. Also, there is a sense in which this representation can be linked to the preceding one by viewing the horizontal line in the first figure as the trace of a plane surface, the measured area of which will be a square. Footnote: we should also view in this light the fact that in the symbols of certain grades of Freemasonry, the degree of opening of the compasses, the legs of which correspond to the sides of the triangle in Figure 7, measures a quarter of a circle, and the chord of this is the side of the inscribed square. And by viewing the vertical line as the radius of a hemispherical surface that meets the terrestrial plane along the line of the horizon. And in fact, according to sensible appearances, heaven and earth meet at their periphery or their outermost borders, namely on the horizon. It should be noted, however, that the reality of which these appearances are symbols must be viewed the other way around, for in terms of that reality they are united not at the periphery, but at the center. Footnote: through a similar application of the principle of inversion, the terrestrial paradise, which also happens to be the point of communication between heaven and earth, appears to be simultaneously at the farthest edge of the world according to the outward point of view, and at the very center of the world according to the inward point of view. See The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times, chapter 23. And if we consider heaven and earth in the state of relative separation required for the cosmos to be able to come into being between them, they communicate with each other along the axis which passes through that center. Footnote: this axis is, of course, identical to the vertical radial in the preceding diagram. But if viewed from this perspective, the radial will not correspond to heaven itself, but will merely represent the direction in which the influence of heaven acts upon earth. This axis simultaneously unites and separates them, or in other terms, it measures the distance between heaven and earth. That is, the extension of the cosmos in the vertical direction, which indicates the hierarchy of the states of manifest existence. Yet at the same time, it also links heaven and earth across this multiplicity of states, and, viewed from this perspective, these states appear as so many rungs by which a being, on the way of return to the principle, may raise himself from earth to heaven. Footnote: hence, the reason why, as we shall see later, the vertical axis is also the way of heaven, Tian Dao. It is also said that heaven, which envelops and embraces all things, presents a ventral, that is to say inward, face to the cosmos, while the earth, that supports all things, presents a dorsal or outward face. Footnote: this equation would be immediately self-evident in a language such as Arabic, in which the abdomen is al-batn and the inward al-batin, the back al-dhar and the outward al-dhahir. This can be easily grasped by simply looking at the diagram below, in which heaven and earth are respectively represented by a concentric circle and a square, figure 8. It will be observed that this diagram reproduces the shape of Chinese coins, which also happens originally to have been the shape of certain ritual tablets. Footnote: on the symbolic value of coins in traditional civilizations in general, see The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times, Chapter 16. The part that the characters are inscribed on, that is the solid area between the circular outline and the square empty space in the center, clearly corresponds to the cosmos comprising the 10,000 beings. Footnote: it is hardly necessary to point out that the characters are the names of the beings, and consequently represent them in a totally natural way, especially in the case of an ideographic script such as the Chinese language. The fact that this area is bounded by two voids is a symbolic expression of the fact that what is not between heaven and earth is for that very reason not a part of manifestation. Footnote: the expression tian sha, literally beneath heaven, is generally used in Chinese to denote the totality of the cosmos. Nevertheless, there is a point on which this diagram can appear inaccurate, and which actually reflects a flaw that is necessarily inherent in every sensible representation. For if one were to go only by the apparent positions of heaven and earth, or rather of what represents them, it could seem that heaven is on the outside and earth on the inside. But the truth is that here again we must not forget to apply the analogy inversely. In reality, inwardness always pertains to heaven, and outwardness to earth, whatever the perspective, and we will come back to this fact again a little further on. Besides, even taking the diagram just as it stands, we can see that because heaven and earth are the outermost boundaries of the cosmos, they actually only have one face as far as the cosmos is concerned, and that this face is inward in the case of heaven and outward in the case of earth. As for their other face, it can only exist in relation to the common principle in which they are unified, and in which all distinction between inward and outward disappears, along with all opposition, and even all complementarity, so that nothing apart from the great unity remains.